Okay, well, I'm following behind what is a great paper. I'm going to be looking at expert ratings as well, and particularly in the case of Parker. We're going to take a slightly different approach to this. And in particular, we're going to use copula functions to attempt to look at the relationship of prices to en premier wine prices to the Parker ratings. I'm going to, I started out with an outline here. Some of this I'm going to skip over relatively quickly, particularly over the mathematics of copula functions. And I won't spend too much time in describing the en premier process, which is the barrel tasting and ratings by experts. There is an issue of how much wine, of course, you put aside for future prices, and so that, you know, for the producer provides some risk in the whole picture, and so it's interesting to know from their perspective, the higher the price, the higher the rating, of course, the higher the price they can set, the less uncertainty about how much wine to put aside for barrel sales or out of barrel sales. The Parker ratings, of course, there's been a lot of issues around that and whether Parker drives prices. We've seen some of this discussion already. He, of course, is viewed as the authority on Bordeaux en premier wines. And so the issue is, what exactly for us is the relationship of his ratings to wine prices? And that's basically what we're after in this study. Now, you know, there's a lot of hedonic price models for wine. The American Journal of Agricultural Economics, the paper in 2015 that came out, did a meta-analysis of that, over 60 studies, 180 hedonic wine price models over a 20-year period. So, you know, we're not trying to add to that literature in any sense here. We're just taking a slightly different approach and looking at what is the exact relationship between prices. That study in the meta-analysis says that a moderate partial correlation of 0.3 between sensory quality ratings and the price of the wine. But there is some non-linearity that seems to be in the relationship, and we've seen that today between the ratings and the prices, and that's what we're kind of after. This is very much a preliminary analysis. We decided to take a different approach to this, and in particular, looking at that dependent structure between the prices and the ratings. And generally, of course, in regression analysis, we assume that that's constant. Of course, my colleague looked at quantile analysis. And what we're going to do is use copula functions to try and model that, which is another approach to looking at a multivariate distribution and being able to identify what might be a structure in there, particularly in the presence of nonlinear dependence. This is the part I'm going to skip over. Copulas are functions that allow us to combine the marginal distributions into a multivariate distribution, and the copula allows us to identify a dependent structure between there. There's non-parametric copulas. Parametric copulas are what we're going to be looking at and comparing. And so I'll show you just sort of pictures of what we're doing here. There's elliptical copulas. The Gaussian copula, you might have some familiarity with the Gaussian copula. If you can recall the 2008 financial crisis, where CDOs, which were combinations of mortgages, were priced using the Gaussian copula. And the Gaussian copula allows a multivariate distribution, and then they could say, well, you see, by combining all these mortgages together, there's less risk, and these things should be rated fairly highly by the bond rating agencies. And of course, what was missing was the idea of tail dependence, that when things go south in the housing market and someone defaults on their mortgage, there's a very high correlation or probability that another mortgage will also default. And of course, there's much more risk in that story than what the normal or Gaussian copia tells us. And student T is also another one that is elliptical in their dependence or symmetric. But we have some other ones that can be identified, and what they do is look for what's called tail dependence. Is there higher correlation in lower values of variables? The Clayton copula, for example, gives us greater dependence in the lower tail. Gumbo copula is a standard thing that says, let's look at this and see if there's higher correlation in the upper tails, and then the Frank copula is in the middle. And then we can take these ones too and see which one fits better as well by inverting the uniform distributions that the various variables have been turned into a 0, 1 number, and we can take the inverse, not the inverse of those, but the negative of those, and so we can also see whether some variation of the copula fits the story. So what we did was we were taking a database that came from an Amsterdam wine cellar. It had the en premier prices. And we're looking at from 2004 to 2010. 2003, Parker gave his ratings after the prices were set, so starting from 2004. And we went up to 2010 because that was a period of time when prices were generally increasing. After 2010, we saw that the en premier prices were a little bit lower. And partly, again, probably due to lower sales, and of course, probably due to that Gaussian copula function in the financial crisis that had occurred in 2008. This is all kind of related. There's an example of the database to take a look at, and it has a number of other experts as well in their ratings, and it was very interesting to see the previous study. Some of our future work I'll talk about was going along those lines as well. So what we did was use a piece of software called Model Risk. If you ever get into copula functions, it's very nice, it's very easy to use. Fitting a copula function, the standard approach is a maximum likelihood test. Some various tests depending on the number of parameters that are part of the copula. And, but there is some, in terms of copula functions, there's still some debate out there around how do you actually test which is the best fitting one, particularly if you then define the marginal distributions and get a multivariate distribution and then look at how that performs is probably the better way to go. But we can basically see some structures and which one of these standard copulas fits the best using maximum likelihood tests. So that's what we did, using the standard copula forms that I talked about. And here, this probably looks better up on the screen than it is when I'm looking at it. Here's an example of 2005. Now the data is for both left and right banks, so we separated those out. And we went year by year. And you can see in this diagram of the data a much higher correlation in the upper prices, upper ratings. His ratings and prices are more highly correlated at higher prices than they are below. And the results show that the Gumbo copula fit well for that. That was combining right and left. Here's an example from 2009 where the Clayton inversed copula fits. And that again is saying, well, this Clayton, which does pick up tail dependence down at the lower end, but if we reverse the numbers, which we can do and use that copula, we again get the high correlation at the high prices and high ratings. And so our results, we went through year by year and looked at left and right bank and combined, and just looking at what's coming out. Now and then, of course, you would see the normal, but you were consistently, in a lot of cases, seeing the Gumbo or the Clayton copula as being the identified copula, indicating this nonlinear dependence between prices and and his ratings. So in general, we found gumbo, or the invertent Clayton copula, best described the bivariate relationship. So tail dependence at the higher correlation between higher ratings, higher prices. The results were consistent, whatever maximum likelihood test we used. Sometimes when you're running these copula functions, you see that the things are not consistent, but it was fairly strong in terms of the three measures that we were using of likelihood. And some evidence that the bivariate relationship for the left bank, the cab-SOF, tended to be stronger than for the right bank, and of course that's consistent with some other findings. Previous studies have showed that Parker's ratings seem to be a little more strongly correlated with the left bank, the cab-SOF. The database, of course, has a number of other experts in there and their rankings, so there's some further work that we can go forward with. We could look at multivariate copula functions. They start getting a bit difficult, but they're, you know, another approach that we can take. And of course, we can standardize, as we've seen, the ratings, maybe do some kind of combination, see just what is the connection. What does this do for a producer? Well, given univariate distributions for the ratings and for the prices, I then have a multivariate distribution that tells me what's the probability that if I get a low rating, you know, where does that lead me in terms of price? If I get a high rating, yes, I can probably consistently put a high price, but on a low rating, there's perhaps some other factors that can come into play here, and I can set my prices accordingly. And takes me to the end.